This is one top Beborga College, Certificate 3 in Theology and Ministry, and this is Lesson 4 of the unit on leadership, team leadership, which is NAT 10866-011. And in this lesson, we're going to be looking at cultures and leadership. Now, this is not necessarily what you would you might be thinking about culture. We actually want to extend your understanding a bit, because every culture, every community has its own way of doing things. And we're going to be looking at a couple of biblical examples, give you a couple of practical, actual historical examples where names and denominations have been buried to protect the guilty. The reason why we've depersonalised it is we actually want you to talk freely about it, so you don't feel like you're actually insulting anybody. Because we want you to think carefully about it, so that if you actually find yourselves in a similar type of environment, you will actually think these things through carefully and wisely. So let's go to the book, and it's page 26. Yeah, excuse me, I just had to sneeze. Okay, so the important thing is every place is different. So every time you come into a new church, a different denomination or culture, people will do things differently. It's, and it's important as a leader that you understand that. I can't overemphasize that, because the way that you do it in your home church may not be what is normal, even in a sister church in the next town. And even within one church, when you're given new roles and responsibilities in your own community, you're going to see things differently, and people will look at you differently. Believe me, coming back into my home church, when I had nearly finished my training as a minister, it was a very different experience. It was actually kind of a weird year. We had we'd been out in field placement for about a year, been doing a lot of leadership responsibilities, and there were three of us who were in the same boat. And an unusual church. We had dozens of people going to ministry, but we were interacting with the congregation differently. We saw them very differently, and it is possible to lead others if you don't understand those differences. However, I can guarantee you're not going to lead well. And if you're not aware of those differences, then you are likely to walk into big mistakes. And it's best to listen and learn, as well as show people that you love them. So we're going to give you a couple of examples, and in class we talk about this. But the first example, a new priest in town calls a congregational meeting, wants to get people together. It's a great idea. However, he had the meeting at the same time as a major community music festival. Now, I've deliberately not mentioned the name or the place. Now, many of the church leaders have been involved with that festival, had led the festival for many years. So I invite you to pause, think about it, and what would you suggest that he have done? Okay, what do you think he should have done? So pause the video now and answer that question. There are a number of things you might put in here. The simplest might have been wise to change to another day. A better answer might include things like, you should have talked to some of these key leaders to find out why they consider this music festival to be an important thing to be at, or more important than church. And you may not necessarily agree with it, but in this case, it would have been good to have known that. An even better thing might be to even go a third step and say, okay, how does your involvement in that actually reflect the life of mission of the church? Now, in some communities, that would obviously be the case. And I think knowing this particular situation, that could well have been a good way to have gone. Okay, so it doesn't really matter what you're going to hear. I'm wanting to get you to think about what kind of answer, what would you have suggested? And the one thing I wouldn't like to see you think to answer is to say they should have listened to the minister. In this case, he was new, he did not know the culture, and in this case, I don't think he even respected the culture because sadly, he didn't listen to anyone. And many of the church leaders were angry with the new priest for being left out of what was an important meeting of the church. And surprise, surprise, he only lasted 6 months at the church before he had to move. That wasn't the only mistake he made. There were a number of other things that he did, but this certainly did not help the situation in that community. I can think of many other examples. One obvious one that I know of in one little country community, rural community, I know of a predecessor who I know his circumstances and I know the circumstances of the community, but a funeral was very, very badly mishandled, and you cannot even mention his name today in that community without people in the community breathing fire. They really did not appreciate it. So there are some things which you need to be aware of, and if there's some things you cannot do because of pain and anguish that you're going through, you need to work that through. But in this case, he just should have listened, and a different date would have resolved all the problems. He tried to make a choice, he made it a choice between his leadership in the church and their community involvement, and they chose the community involvement, and it became an us and them situation, and it failed badly and wrecked his ministry. Whereas it could, even though it was not a church that I was part of, I knew the community well enough to know this was a really key part of the entire community. One of the major events, community events of the year, and one of the ways in which the church would help shape the community. And I would have advised him, move to a different date, and you make sure you go to that event and become part of it, even if you don't like it, even if it's not your style of music. And so a few mistakes there. Okay, let's go for a better example, because they're not always bad. The pastor was called to replace somebody who was retiring, and the old pastor died suddenly before he retired. And it was interesting because the order, they'd actually called the new pastor, and in this case it was only days before the old pastor died. But it was before his retirement send-off, and the new pastor talked to key leaders, travelled and attended the funeral, and he moved into the community from another town and led the congregational worship 2 days after he moved, so I hadn't even had a chance to unpack. So here's a simple yes/no question. Was this better than example one? And then what would you have done differently? So again, pause it, but think about the things that you might have done in that situation. What might have you have done differently? Okay, so we restart. So I'd be surprised if you think this was a better way of approaching things in the other case. What could have been done differently? It's one of those things, when you move in, you do need to take time to settle into a community. And you need to learn how things work in the community. You need to find out where the shops are. You need to make sure you've got the phone on, and all the other things that that's whole. If you've got a mobile phone, make sure people know your number. In that case, I think the one thing that could have been done differently was he could have asked the denomination to actually provide some intensive pastoral care in the community. People lose somebody who they love dearly, they are going to be going through sorry business. Somebody needs to do it. And if this pastor hadn't been able to do this, who would have provided the pastoral care? That would have been the main thing that I would have seen done differently there. Now, that pastor stayed in that community for over 7 years. And I know the person very well. And led the congregation through some good times and through some very, very serious problems. But one of the things that this pastor had, which the other pastor didn't, was this person, in the midst of crisis, from the very beginning, the people knew that this pastor loved them and would listen to them. So there was no honeymoon period of them getting to know the person. He was their pastor from the word go. So we do know leaders make mistakes. Remember, you need to remember, you're not God. Been quite a few times I've told Christian leaders, put your cape back in the wardrobe, along with the blue long johns, and for goodness sake, wear your undies on the inside of your pants. You are not Superman or Superwoman. There is only one Messiah, and you are not him. So you're going to make mistakes. But if you listen and learn from your community and learn how they do things, you're going to make less mistakes. And in the book, if you show that you love, if leaders show that they love their people, I'm not even sure which screen I share there. If leaders show that they love their people, okay. If leaders show that they love the people, they will be forgiven many of their mistakes, because we're going to make them. Okay, so let's look at some examples in the Bible. And we're going to go Old Testament and New Testament. So there are many cases in the Bible of leaders finding themselves and learning to lead in different cultures. The first one is Daniel. Now, we know that Daniel was a great leader of God's people, and he was remembered for giving hope to his people in a very dark time. And of course, we know the famous one of him being fed to the lions. And I saw this picture and I went, wow, there's a younger man. This certainly happened in the early part of Daniel's career. Now, we know that Daniel's definitely not an easy book to read. Encourage you to have a look at the Bible Project and get an overview of the book of Daniel, because there's a bit of history, there's a lot of apocalyptic literature in it as well. But these are things you need to know. So that Daniel and many other promising leaders from Israel were forcibly relocated. So they were removed from the land and moved to Babylon. The Babylonian government tried to assimilate them into Babylonian culture. This is starting to ring some bells. And they were made to learn a different language. And they tried to make them stop following law and custom by making them eat wrong foods and worshipping Babylonian gods. It's a real challenge. And one of the reasons I believe it's a really important example to use with Indigenous men and women. Daniel and others resisted this and held on to their identity and customs. And this was very, very hard. The first lesson for leadership is never let go of who you are, who God's called you to be. Now, we know that they suffered further persecution for their faith. They also experienced racism, and their enemies arranged to have them put to death. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with the fire, and Daniel eventually with lions. But the important thing is they relied on God and were able to see through these trials. And there's a few parts of Daniel there to have a look at. Now, the source of Daniel's strength was his faithful prayer-filled worship life. I'm just wondering whether I should. No, leave it there. So Daniel showed grace in the face of these personal attacks. And he continued, now this is really interesting, man of two worlds, he continued to wisely serve the government, even though it was not his government, not his culture. His fierce, gracious determination made him a senior advisor to at least 3 generations of very different, very difficult and corrupt government. Okay, his leadership ability was not defined by the corruption or the justice or the wisdom of the government that he served. And it is interesting that he survived violent changes. So even when the government was violently overthrown, they turned to Daniel, and he was remembered as a wise leader and a wise spiritual leader who gave hope. Now we can, oh man, there's so many people we could put in here. Name leaders amongst your own people who, like Daniel, show fierce, gracious determination and difficulty and continue to give hope to your people. So there's a whole range of them that I can think of, from Doug Nichols, Gary Foley is another one that comes to mind. When I was growing up, was the Senator. Might be Koki Mabo. There may be a whole range of people. If you can think of them, there may be somebody even in your own community. Just name them, and it's people you know. And if you can't think of anybody, ask your support person, give us a call. We talk through a few examples. There may be people relevant to your mob and your locality than other people. And I think of the people who led the freedom rides here in Australia. In my own tradition, men like Don Brady and Charles and Dorothy Harris are examples of people who made major changes to Indigenous people and to the life of the church that I belong to. So pause and fill that in. Okay, let's go back and have a look at the New Testament. And I think it was Robert Banks who has taught here. He actually talked about Paul being the walkabout apostle. Just love the example. It was something he came up with when he was teaching at Nungalinga many years ago. And some of our best examples actually come out of class interaction, which I miss it so much this year. So we know that Paul was the leader of a minority group. He was Jewish in a dominant Greek-Roman culture. Now, Roman culture valued strong, often violent leaders, and who looked important before anybody else. And it was a culture that looked after their own mob, their own community, your own town, your own family. As I explain it to kids in RE in scripture class, Roman culture was run by the bullies. Being a bully was valued, and the biggest bullies were on top. Quite the opposite of what we want to see. Quite a violent, nasty culture. Jewish culture was considered odd, but it was old and therefore it was respected. So Paul was able to move from his own culture and he became a, I believe, became a successful leader in a culture that was not like his own. So his journey is described throughout the book of Acts. We've talked a little bit about that in the last lesson. His advice to churches and their leaders makes up the bulk of the New Testament. We've already had a bit of a look at his advice to the young leader Timothy. Now we'll look at leadership in different cultures and a couple of examples, and of how Paul worked with his own mob and with those who were actually new to him. So get you to have a look at Acts chapter 17, first couple of verses, to see what Paul did when there were people of his own mob in town. So pause and do that now. I'm just going to pull up my just love how everything, I'm sharing the screen and everything's going on one screen. I don't want you to see everything. Just double checking my answers now. Okay, so this is what it says. According to Paul's his usual habit, Paul went first to the synagogue, and he okay, that is not right. Taught for about 3 weeks. And he quoted and explained the scriptures and proved that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from death. So some people were convinced and joined Paul and Silas. And Paul led from what they knew about God to Jesus. So they knew the scriptures and he quoted from them and led and showed how Jesus was part of it. So that's Acts 17. Now, that was when there was a synagogue in town. Now, I want to introduce you to something which a friend of mine described as the purple pajama principle. And if this sticks in your head, great. It's weird. And so I invite you to read Acts 16, 6 through to verse 15. So this is when Paul leaves Asia, crosses over into Europe, and arrives at Philippi. Now, you'll notice in the text there's this subtle change from they to we. So Luke, as the author of Acts, joins Paul's team. And we know that it's at least Paul, Silas, probably Timothy, and Luke. Now, they'd arrived in this new country, and none of them knew the country. They'd never been there before. They didn't know its people or its customs. And when they arrived in Philippi, there's no synagogue. So what does Paul do? He does something different, which I'm going to call, one of a better term, the purple pajama principle. So, and the thing is, of course, that night, as Paul's team's going to bed in Lydia's house with purple sheets, purple pillows, and purple pajamas, they must have been amazed at how God had called them to this new place and had made the way for them. So here's what he did. First thing was, God called, he went, so he obeyed God. He tried to find people from his own mob, couldn't find them. So he went to where people gathered. And in this case, there were women doing the laundry and pounding on rocks down by the waterside, fairly lengthy process. No surprise Lydia was there for lengthy. She's a seller of purple cloth. She must have had a lot of product to wash. So they went to where people were gathered, and he talked to them, and he built relationships. And just as Jesus had sent, when he sent the disciples out 2 by 2, he thankfully accepted support. So when Lydia offers to put him up for the night, and a bit longer, they said thank you. In other places, we know that he actually supported himself, or was actually supported by the church who sent them. And then the group spent time. Now, what Acts doesn't actually tell us, but we know from some of the dating of some of the other things that some scholars think they may have spent many months in Philippi before they had to leave in a hurry. Okay, so those are the steps. That's the purple pajama principle. Obey God, go, try to find your own mob, go to where people gather, talk to them, build relationships, accept support, and spend time. And so while Paul was the leader, he gathered a team around him to work, pray, and teach for the new church. When Paul and Silas had to leave, Luke stayed with the new church. We know that because the we becomes they again after this section. So we know Luke knew Paul and Silas well, but he wasn't with them all the time. So Paul is involved in changing culture. So he changes his culture. He changes from one culture to another. And we know that every culture has things which are good. And there's always a reflection of the Creator in the way that we live. But at the same time, every culture has things that need rethinking once we know Christ. And we talk about this more fully in the Gospel and Culture unit that Father Victor has videos that he's recording at the same time as I'm recording these. And talks about that in a bit more detail. And the reason he's doing it is we can't really teach gospel and culture without an Indigenous teacher taking you through. It just would not, it would be highly inappropriate. So it's not only culture. The good news of Jesus challenges everyone personally. It challenges how we live together. And a good leader handles that challenge very carefully and very prayerfully. And again, Paul shows us how to do this. So when Paul went into Europe, when he went into Greece, he already knew the language and the culture of this new mob. He'd learned about it. Some of that was because it was actually dominant culture for him. So we know that in the last half of Acts 17, when he goes to Athens, he uses a lot of Greek poetry and quotes how well-known Greek thinkers in that sermon. So there's a key idea. He uses their language and their ideas when he speaks to them. One of the ways to build up rapport, one of the ways to build relationship. And I was reading something from a person who planted the church in the middle of New York, and he said that this is exactly the thing that he was doing, starting from scratch and finding out where people are in an incredibly diverse community, learning their language, their ideas, their philosophy, so that he can actually make connections with them. Now, one of the problems that we have is that, or one of the problems this culture had is looking after their own people. And I really think that should actually be numbered. See, one of the problems with the Greek and Roman culture was that everyone was concerned about their status. How they looked was important. This was probably not as pronounced as the whole Twitter social media influence type thing that's happening at this particular point in history. But everybody's concerned about the status. They also only help people in their own group. So if you're part of their mob, they looked after you. Anybody else was fair game to be taken advantage of. So much so that it was considered good fun to take advantage of others if you could. New guy comes to town, you take the mickey out of them and take advantage of them. In Australia, Banjo Patterson has a wonderful poem called Been There Before, where somebody's actually offered a drink on a very hot, dry, thirsty day if you can just chuck a rock across the creek. And he says, yeah, I can do that, and takes the bet on, and comes down the creek, and of course there's not a stone anywhere in sight, because it's a sandy creek. But he pulls a stone out of his pocket and chucks it across and wins the bet. Been there before. Okay, so but in Greek and Roman culture, yeah, they would take fun of you like that all the time, and that attitude is a lot of what Paul confronts in Corinthians. He doesn't some of the other letters as well, but this attitude of looking after your own needs to be broken down within Christian community. It was actually one of the problems in Greek and Roman culture. So everybody wanted their group to be the most important, and you see that in Acts chapter 2 and 3. So Paul teaches against cultural normal. So if you're in Christ, we're all the same. Greek, Jew, slave free, men, women. And that's what makes that particular part of his letters really, really important. So the thing is, as a leader, you don't just care for your mob or care for them out of duty. You love and care for everyone. So he actually set the example. Now I'm going to ask you to pause and answer this question. So list some of the ways you've seen that kind of love and care happen in your church community. Pause it now. Okay, we're back, and you may have a number of examples. One of the things that draws people to church is the authenticity of that sort of love. These people do really love each other. Wow, can this be real? As well as God actually speaking to their hearts. But that's some of the stuff that really makes church come alive. If you can't think of any examples for this, give me a call. I do know it does happen in some places. The next bit here is I invite you to have a look at Romans 16. Again, pause the video after you've read the question and list at least 3 women that you can identify. So Paul talked to everybody. Some people have the idea Paul didn't like women in leadership because of what he says in Corinthians, but we know he worked with female leaders. So what he's saying in Corinthians was dealing with a local problem, not a general principle. The other thing is Paul didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble often found him. But Paul wanted to tell people about Jesus, so he remained focused on the real job, which was sharing Jesus. Yet we know he got into trouble. And when it happened, he dealt with it graciously, prayerfully, and with praise. So in Philippi, he ends up in jail. And because they're praying and praising God in the midst of being in jail, in the midst of an earthquake, that led to the conversion of his jailer and his family. And this is also different to what was expected culture. In that culture, leaders were supposed to be strong, proud, dominant, and look the part. You would never accept any sign of disrespect. Never. But Paul says, when I'm weak, Christ is strong. But here is Paul, happy to have nothing, forgiving and even loving people who hurt him. Paul shares his weakness in humility, and it's a very different way of being a leader for this culture. Shows a new pattern. So this next two questions, I'll deal with them and then get you to pause. So there's two questions and a task. So I want you to be thinking about your own mob. So what are three things that you think are important for a leader in your community? Now, it could even deal with a specific problem that your community is having at the moment, that you need a leader has a particular set of skills. You could put that in. Or it could be more general. But what are the things which are important for people being a leader in your community? It could be integrity, could be caring, could be wisdom, a whole range of things. Now, the second one is, after you pick up three of those things, imagine somebody asks you to do what Paul did and go lead something in another community. So they're a different mob, and they might even be your mob, but they're in a different community, so they're going to be different. So think about what we've talked about with different cultures. Talk to some people from other mob if you need to. Name two things that they do differently to your mob. Okay, so do that, and then the third case would be, imagine you're doing something in a dominant cultural organisation, which a number of us, I know a number of students are doing, being involved in environmental panels and setting hunting limits in land councils, whatever it happens to be. You're talking to somebody about how to do leadership in a dominant cultural organisation. Imagine you're doing it, or talk to somebody who's done it. What are the things that somebody from your mob needs to know when they're actually working in those organisations? It could be something simple as they have this weird fixation on time and punctuality, that they often don't look at the whole picture. They often don't know what they need to know. So those could be some of the things. So I invite you to pause and answer those three questions. Okay, as we restart, every community, every congregation, every church is different. I can't overstress that. And when you're moving from somewhere to another place, here are some of the things you'd be thinking about each time you're in a new community, or even when you're given a new leadership role within your own. So there are always official and unofficial leaders. So who's supposed to be in charge and who is actually in charge? I remember one of my first churches. I remember sitting there with the leadership group and I asked them a question. It was a fairly simple question. Went around the group and nothing. Then one person who had no official position piped up and said something, and everybody agreed with him, even though they didn't necessarily agree with him. Interesting dynamic. He was actually in charge, not the people who actually had the name. Quite an eye-opener. But it's not always the same people. It may well be that in some of your communities, you may have an auntie or an uncle who's been greatly respected and actually does really control things, even though they're not able to get around and do things anymore. I can think of a number of communities where that's the case. Sometimes it can be a problem. Other times, those people are incredibly wise and encourage others. So the other questions you need to ask is, what are local customs? How do they do things? What is different? You come into my church, typical North Queensland church. The signboard says we start church at 9. We're lucky to start by 10 or quarter past. It's just how things happen up here. It frustrates me immensely, but that's just how it happens. When I had a Tongan congregation, we were supposed to start at 2, but the service could start anywhere between 1:30 and 3, depending on when the Tongan language preacher turned up, because that person had other responsibilities on the other side of the city. But it may be that sitting together for a meal afterwards is very important. There may be expectations that your denomination has on what a leader ought to do and should be doing. So you need to identify a few things about local leadership. How is leadership responsibility shared? Does anybody get to share it? What do they do? If you want to get an event going, who actually gets it organised? There might be a feast, a Cut Murray, a cultural event, outreach activity. Who actually organises it? It doesn't matter who comes up with the idea, but who actually gets it organised. And I remember being in Arakan at one stage, and I knew we had to have the elders lead the denominational leaders in, and I was fully expecting to take a significant amount of time for all the aunties and the elders to work out what order and how we're going to come in, and that's exactly what happened. So you need to be aware of that stuff. And how do they do it? Find out if you don't know. Now, if you do those things, I'm not going to promise that you will not make mistakes, because I'm guaranteeing you probably will. But if you come out and say, I don't know, and I need to help people find, you need to help me find out, things so that I don't make mistakes, then you will make less mistakes. And if you're willing to listen and challenge on the base of the gospel after that, then people will forgive you your mistakes, and you may see things change. There's a few examples that I can think of which are incredibly difficult. You might think that it's good to actually have a good early night on a Sunday night fellowship so all the kids can get to school the next day. I think for a couple of communities where that was happening, as I had one uncle tell me about one community, he was saying, the downside is this community, there was a lot of violence, and being at church was the one place and the one time in town that people felt safe. So don't cut it off too soon. And the reality was, in that community, the school attendance was pretty minimal anyway. So while it was a good idea to actually get kids to school, in this community, the crying need at the time was being safe. One of the other communities that I'm aware of, there are a number of fellowship meetings being held during the week. There's a bit of revival going on. People coming to the Lord, people growing in faith and the gifts of the Spirit and all this wonderful stuff. And a couple of local school teachers talked to them, one of the missionary organisations, said, can you do something about this? We've got kids coming to school tired the next day. And the missionary group said, we've got nothing to do with it. The local Indigenous leaders are the ones who are actually leading the group. In fact, if we try and involve anything as outsiders, as Europeans, usually it kills it dead flat. We don't have control. So in that situation, even though they were nominally supposed to be in charge, the beauty of what was happening was the church was growing on its own legs. So those are some of the things you look at. Who actually makes the real decisions is really important, and you need to know why and how communities do the things that they do, and you can work it through. So you may be called to be a Daniel, you may be called to be a Paul, but do it with grace, determination, and humility. And that is the end of lesson 4. And I'll join you again for lesson 5.